This next video is one of the more popular videos that I posted on my Beat Diabetes channel. It has to do with the subject, if I had sky-high blood sugar, what would I do? Most of the time when we've just been diagnosed with diabetes, we're just ignorant, completely ignorant of what it is, how it comes, and what we can do about it. And when I first started having my own struggle with blood sugar, my metabolic system was just in the process of breaking down. My glucose levels overall weren't all that bad. But later, as I spent more and more time encouraging diabetics and learning more and more about diabetes, I knew I had to make this video describing what I would do today if, knowing what I know now, I had just come home from the doctor with a terrible A1C and a diagnosis of severe diabetes. One of the things that makes me a little different from many of the diabetic instructors and doctors is that I'm one of you. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professional nutritionist, but I am a guy who got hit with all the symptoms of approaching diabetes and took it seriously and managed to get things under control. Now, because I went right after it while my metabolic system was just in the process of breaking down, I've never had the experience of having a doctor talking to me in a grave voice and telling me that I have raging diabetes with an A1C of 9 or more, and glucose numbers up to 200, 300, or 400. I got mine under control before it ever came to that, and as far as I know, my A1Cs have never even hit the 6.5 mark, which in America is the classic number that determines that you're diabetic. But since I've been doing this YouTube channel, which focuses on diabetes, I've heard from so many people who've had incredibly high A1Cs. In fact, in an interview I plan to be posting soon, I'm going to interview a fairly young man with the incredibly high A1C of 17, or at least that's what he was at. Hearing of all these sky-high A1Cs, you know, the kind where you're constantly thirsty, constantly urinating, your vision is totally blurred, your feet are either numb or they're killing you, it's made me think about just what I would do, knowing what I know now, if I were in that situation. And so I determined to make a video to answer that question. Just what would I do? What steps would I take if I just came home from the doctor with an A1C in the double digits? My body, my health, my life was falling apart, and I knew that unless I experienced some kind of major intervention, I'm in big, big trouble. But before we get to the steps I would take, I want to share an illustration with you to kind of set the stage and give you a mental picture of what raging diabetes is really all about. Let's imagine I'm walking down a city street at night, minding my own business. Suddenly, out of an alley, a huge thug comes up to me and picks a fight with me. The man is bigger than me, stronger than me, tougher than me, and on top of all that, he's carrying a tire iron. He immediately lets me know he's not my friend, and he begins to beat me, punching me, kicking me, and hitting me all over my body with his tire tool. And these are not just light, easy blows. He's hitting me with all his force, and he is one big, tough dude. Doesn't take me long to figure out I'm in trouble, real trouble. Now, I'll fight him the best I can, but he and I both know I'm no match for him. Every punch and kick that he lands, every crack of his tire tool on my bones is weakening me, and I realize if I don't get some kind of help, this guy's going to kill me. Some people nearby see the fight and they gather around to watch. They realize I'm the good guy here and they try to give some advice. They don't actually help me much, but they figure their advice is help enough. But it's very strange advice. I cry out to the onlookers, "Help me please, this guy's going to kill me." A little old lady shouts to me with a shrill voice, "Have you had your vitamin C today?" I yell back, "What are you talking about? I don't need vitamin C. I need a weapon or maybe two." One man tells me, "Just take the blows. The more you get hit, the tougher you'll get, and eventually you'll win the fight." I can't believe such stupid advice. Another person tells me, "I think what you need is just punch a little harder. If you punch harder, I think you can beat this guy." I shout back at him, "I'm punching as hard as I can, and it's doing nothing at all. I need a weapon." Once I pick up a rock to try to throw it at my adversary, but one of the old men shouts out at me, "No, no, no, do all things in moderation. That rock is not moderate." Finally, I find a friend. A middle-aged man dressed nicely has just joined the crowd, watching me get the tar beat out of me. But this guy does more than watch. He shouts at me, "Hey, you!" And when I turn my head in his direction, he throws something at me. I catch it and I realize he's just thrown me a taser. He says, "Give him a taste of that." Well, that sounds good to me, and when the bully moves in close to give me another blow, I touch him with the taser, sending a powerful electric shock through his body. He falls to the ground trembling and shaking. He can hardly believe that he's ended up on the losing end of the fight. Then my friend walks up to me and hands me a .45 Magnum revolver. He says, "Point this at him and tell him you're not afraid to use it." Well, I do just that, and the trembling bully staggers to his feet, takes one look at the revolver, turns tail, and runs for his life, screaming like a little girl. I turn back to my new friend and tell him, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. You saved my life." He tells me casually, "Oh, you just needed a couple of weapons. When you've got the right weapons in your hands, bullies are not nearly as tough as they seem." Well, I think all of you are bright enough to figure out what that bully represents, which is, of course, the scourge of diabetes. And like the bully in the story, diabetes can maim, it can kill, it can destroy your health day by day. But if you have and you use the right weapons, you'll find diabetes isn't quite as tough as it's made out to be. But let's get back to the question of what I would do, knowing what I know now, if I just found out I had raging, totally out of control diabetes with an A1C in the double digits. The first thing that needs to be said is that this is a totally different situation from somebody who's just moved into the pre-diabetic range of, let's say, 6.1. His doctor tells him, "Well, you need to be kind of careful. I don't like the direction you're going." Well, being pre-diabetic is not a good situation, but normally you have a little time to work on it, to try some things and be a little more moderate in your approach. You're not yet fighting for your life. You may be sometime later, but right now you're in the mode of researching, thinking, perhaps making some changes, but not necessarily drastic changes, at least not right away. But when your blood sugar is sky high and you're being beaten to death by the bully of diabetes every single day, you don't have the luxury of taking your time and gradually making some changes. You cannot possibly adopt the motto of moderation in all things. Moderation is going to be the death of you. You're literally killing yourself with that sky-high blood sugar, and you need to get radical, and you need to find some weapons that will work powerfully against your enemy. The good news is those weapons exist. And if I just found out I had raging diabetes and, say, glucose levels of 300, 400, 500, I would make the necessary changes on a dime. So what would I do? First, I'd make radical, permanent changes in my diet. I'd give up all bread immediately. Most bread, other than the keto bread that you make yourself, is going to raise blood sugar almost as quickly and as sharply as eating pure sugar. When it comes to blood sugar, there's very little difference between a piece of bread and eating several teaspoons of table sugar. I would give it up in a heartbeat. No more dinner rolls, no more hamburger buns, no more pretzels, bagels, donuts, biscuits, pasta, tortillas, chapatis, roti, naan, burritos, crackers, muffins. Any form and every form of bread would be swept from my house. I would, of course, give up sugar, but also any foods containing sugar, such as ketchup, barbecue sauce, breakfast cereals, yogurt. I'd stop putting sugar in my coffee, stop putting sugar in my tea, or sprinkling sugar over anything at all. I would look on sugar as poison and stay as far away from it as possible. No more cake, no more ice cream, no more pie, no more candy bars. All of it must go. And horror of horrors, I would give up on all fruit except for berries, and even with them I'd be careful. I'd give up on starches, especially rice, corn, and potatoes. No more French fries, no more baked potatoes, no more hash browns, no more grits, no corn on the cob, and dishes with rice. I'd lay off beans entirely. Now, I know beans can work for some, But when your blood sugar's in the stratosphere, even the iffy foods, those not entirely bad but not so great either, they would be stricken from my diet. Now, you may be saying, what in the world would you eat? I would focus on meat and low-carb vegetables, eggs, cream and cheese, avocados and nuts, berries, but not too many. Now, some of the foods that I mentioned earlier that I would give up might be okay to reintroduce into your diet later once you get things under control. I do eat certain forms of lower-carb bread at times. I sometimes will eat a small bowl of beans. But if I had incredibly high blood sugar, I wouldn't. My one goal in life would be to survive until I can get my blood sugar under control. This is no time for moderation. This is no time to worry about whether I'm missing out on getting a little extra nutrition when I skip fruit. This is time to annihilate my enemy. Afterwards, I might be a little more moderate, but not now. For now, this is war. This radical restriction in carbohydrates is one of the most powerful weapons you can ever use against the bully of diabetes. Exercise is good, but it's more like a slingshot. Carbohydrate restriction is like a cannon. Diabetes cannot stare down the barrel of it without fearing and trembling. When you slash those carbohydrates from your diet, you're literally starving diabetes, choking the life out of it, and it has no choice but to retreat. But I wouldn't stop with just one weapon. There is another weapon almost as powerful. When it's combined with serious carbohydrate restriction, diabetes is nearly always beaten, and often within a matter of a few months. What is the second weapon? It's what has been popularly called intermittent fasting, but I prefer to call it time-restricted eating, since you're not really fasting, you're simply limiting the amount of time each day that you're going to eat. Of course, if you go a whole day without eating, then I would call that fasting, but if you're simply saying, I'm only going to eat between the hours of, say, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. each day, well, I don't think that's really fasting. You're just restricting the amount of time you're going to eat. The problem with many Americans and people all over the world is that their window of eating lasts from the moment they get up in the morning until the time they go to bed at night. When they're not eating meals, they're snacking. When they're not snacking, they're eating meals. And this constant grazing and snacking is unnatural, unhealthy, strength-sapping, blood sugar raising, and a perfectly miserable way to live. But on the other hand, to restrict your hours of eating to a couple of meals, perhaps 5 or 6 hours apart, and then refuse to eat again until that time rolls around the next day, has proven to be an absolute game changer for diabetics, or should I say former diabetics, because that is what you will be once you employ the weapon of carbohydrate restriction and time-restricted eating. You will become, according to the numbers, a former diabetic. I recently heard an interview with Dr. Jason Fung, and he was saying that for most of his patients, he puts much more emphasis on intermittent fasting than he does a low-carb diet. Not because he doesn't believe in cutting the carbs, but he finds that most people have an easier time with cutting down their window of eating than they do figuring out how to do low-carb and then doing it. But if one devastating weapon is good, 2 devastating weapons are wonderful. If I found out I had sky-high diabetes, I wouldn't mess around with a gentle, mild form of time-restricted eating. No 12-hour window or 10-hour window for me. I would go to probably a 5-hour window and have my first meal every day at about 1 p.m., my second meal and last meal, low carb of course, at 6 p.m., and that would be it. Once dinner was over, not a bit of food, not even a couple of eggs would touch my lips until the next day at 1 p.m. Now, I probably would have some coffee with heavy cream and butter in it as a breakfast substitute. You may be saying, man, that's pretty radical. Yeah, it is, but diabetes is nothing to mess around with. Neuropathy is pretty radical. Losing your eyesight is pretty radical. Having to urinate every 15 minutes is pretty radical. Having your legs cut off above the knee is pretty radical. And dying 15 years too soon is pretty radical. I would far rather make some radical diet and lifestyle changes than have some radical health problems destroying my body. Now, the window of eating may be opened wider once you get things under control, but while you're in that fight for your life, it's better to keep that eating window pretty small. Every hour that you do not eat is bringing you restoration and health. I mentioned that diet is far more powerful than exercise, but I would exercise. I wouldn't necessarily go to the gym every day, but I would use something like an elliptical trainer, which is in fact what I do, or a treadmill, or simply go for a half-an-hour walk. But the best exercise of all is the exercise of your will when you say no to potatoes, no to Little Debbie's, no to ice cream, no to rice, and so forth. One other thing I would do, I would watch videos like this one and other similar ones and read good books such as those by Dr. Jason Fung and Dr. Richard Bernstein to keep my motivation high. Can diabetes really be beaten? Oh yeah, it can. We get reports daily from happy, excited, enthusiastic, former diabetics who have joined the club. What club is that? It's the club of those who have seen their A1C dip down into the 5s, or sometimes even the 4s, and that's a great club to be in. But you'll never join this club with little, mild, moderate, cautious efforts. Bullies are not impressed with moderate, cautious people, but they are terrified when you're carrying the right weapons and willing to get as radical as you have to win the fight. And there is another thing I would do if I had sky-high blood sugar. I would pray. In fact, I would pray before anything else. You didn't just pop into existence, and you're not an accident. You were made by the divine Creator, and He is more than willing to jump into your fight with you and give you the victory. And if you're wondering, why did God give me diabetes? The answer is He didn't. Type 2 diabetes is pretty much a do-it-yourself disease. We eat horribly, and then we reap horrible results. In the following video, I deal with the question of the cause and root of diabetes. Is it genetics, or is it behavior and lifestyle? Well, it's a complicated subject, and how you approach this can make all the difference in whether you aggressively attack your enemy or simply try to live with it. Not long ago, a lady left me a comment that I want to share with you and then give a response. She wrote this: I really love your videos, and after 12 years of research, I can say that I agree with so much of what you say. But I do not agree that we gave ourselves insulin resistance, or as other people call it, type 2 diabetes. You should look up the genetic factors that contribute to this. Now, that's not to say that once you are diagnosed with this, that you have no control over it by changing your diet. You've done it, and I have. But there's a genetic factor. If it were true that we all get this only because we're stuffing our faces with sugar and carbs, then why does one person get it and not the person next to them eating even more? You have to look at the genetics also. So what do you think? Why do you have diabetes? Is it bad genes or bad behavior? It's a complicated subject, and it requires a bit more than a 1 or 2 minute answer. So I'm taking this edition of Beat Diabetes to explore this subject a little more fully. The first thing I need to say is that you had better hope that it's not just bad genetics, because if it is genetics and only genetics that gave you diabetes, there would be precious little you could do about it. You're just one of the poor, unfortunate minority that were born with all the wrong genes, and now you have it. You cannot have gene surgery and change yourself, so just take your meds and hope for the best. You poor, poor thing. You poor, sad, pathetic, miserable genetic abnormality. Well, of course, if you've been watching my videos, you know I don't believe that at all. If my YouTube videos consisted of me telling you that you're just one of the unlucky ones, so deal with it, well, I don't think too many people would be watching. Of course, there is a genetic component, and we'll talk about that later on, but it is not the primary factor as far as I'm concerned. Here's one indisputable proof that diabetics is more than just genetically based. The rate of diabetes is not static. It can easily change from culture to culture and time period to time period. And right now, in our American culture, as well as in many other cultures around the world, the rate of diabetes is absolutely exploding. Diabetes is skyrocketing in America, in India, in China, in Africa, and in so many other nations. It is exploding among white people, black people, Asians, Hispanics. A few generations ago, diabetes was so rare it was almost non-existent. Today, it is everywhere and shows no sign of leveling off. Talk about a pandemic. We have a pandemic of metabolic syndrome all over the world. Let me put it another way. Let me talk to you who have been diagnosed with diabetes. Suppose at your birth, you and your parents were whisked off to some time machine and were transported to live in America in the 1700s during the days of the birth of the United States. You were raised on a farm where you ate natural foods. There were no candy bars, there was no soda, there were no breakfast cereals, and even the fruit that was eaten was unmodified. It had far less sugar in it than our modified fruit that we find at grocery stores today. And secondly, the fruit was only eaten in season, and then you'd have to say goodbye until next year. In your life in America in the 1700s, you worked hard, you almost never snacked, and you stayed slim all of your life. Guess what? If that were the case, probably about 95% or more of you would go through your entire lives and never become diabetics. But of course, there are no time machines, and you did not grow up in the 1700s. You grew up in the 1970s or 1980s or whenever. You ate candy all the time, you guzzled sodas, you ate breakfast cereal several times a week, you made frequent stops to Dunkin' Donuts, and here you are watching this YouTube channel called Beat Diabetes, and you've been told by your doctor that you are diabetic. Do you suppose that this has anything at all to do with the way you've been eating? They do not call diabetes a lifestyle disease for nothing, my friend. In today's world, it has become fashionable and cool to declare that nothing is our fault. If we drink alcohol too much, well, we have the disease of alcoholism, and it has nothing to do with any choices that we've ever made. If we're unfaithful to our spouses, it must be because we have some kind of sex addiction. So don't blame us, just give us a pill or a few therapy sessions. If a man beats his wife, he obviously has beat-wife-itis and clearly needs to go to rehab for this. And people will carry on with this rejection of accountability into the realm of diabetes. Well, I was just unlucky and I got diabetes. Never mind the fact that I'm 100 pounds overweight, I eat a horrendous diet, I never exercise, and I guzzle 7 or 8 sugar-saturated sodas every day. But as I said, there is a positive side to this. The fact that our lifestyle has led us inexorably toward diabetes means that a change of lifestyle can lead us right back out again. And the good news is, no, the great news is that this can happen fast. In fact, amazingly fast for most of us. You do not have to stay diabetic. You can get your A1C and your fasting glucose into a non-diabetic range, and we've received thousands of reports from people who've done just this. You may always have what I call diabetes tendencies, but that doesn't mean you always have to be a diabetic. In America, most doctors will call you diabetic if your A1C is 6.5 or higher. They'll call you pre-diabetic if your A1C is 5.7 to 6.4, and they'll call you non-diabetic if your A1C is 5.6 or lower. Nearly all type 2s can get to that magic range of 5.6 or lower, and many of them can do it without meds. They may have to start out with meds, but in many cases they'll be able to drop the meds under their doctor's care at some point. And as Dr. Richard Bernstein demonstrates by his own life and his many successes with his own patients, even type 1 diabetics can have A1Cs in the non-diabetic range. Is there a genetic aspect to diabetes? Well, of course there is. But it's not as though some people are destined to get it and others are destined never to have it. The truth is that people who eat the monstrous standard diet of this age, with lots of starches, mountains of sweet pastries, gallons or kilos of sugar-laced drinks, our whole world is heading toward diabetes. But some people are genetically disposed to get there sooner than others. Let me use an illustration. Imagine a huge marathon race that will cover 100 miles. Thousands and thousands of people are running in this race, and at the finish line is diabetes. That's right. Whenever anyone crosses the finish line, they immediately become a full-scale diabetic. So this is one race you do not want to win. In fact, you don't even want to finish. Now, once the race begins, as is always the case, some people are faster runners than others. Some people run fast, some people are average, and some run like turtles. But the point is that every single runner is headed for the same ultimate destination, the finish line that makes one a diabetic. But the faster runners are going to get there much quicker than the slower ones. In this case, it pays to be slow. During the course of the race, there are people lined up on the sidelines with various shoes for sale. Some are top-quality running shoes which will enable the runners to get to the finish line much quicker than they otherwise would. And some are selling steel-reinforced boots which will slow the runners down, ensuring that they'll be one of the last to reach the finish line. So the ones who will finish ahead of all the others are the ones who are A, genetically inclined to be fast, and B, stop and purchase the super-duper running shoes. The ones who will reach that finish line of diabetes last are those who are A, genetically inclined to be slow runners, and B, purchase the work boots. But throughout the 100-mile run, there are a few people standing on the sidelines shouting out to the runners, "Stop! This is a race you do not want to finish. There's nothing but sickness and death at the end of it. Just stop your running and quit the race." These people are considered by most of the runners as fanatics and morons, and most people don't pay any attention to them. But a few are convinced, they stop running, quit the race, and go back to their homes. And of course, they're the smart ones, the ones who will never cross over into the land of diabetes. Okay, what's the point? As long as we eat the way most people in our world eat, we are all headed toward metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and diabetes. Some are genetically inclined to run this race faster than others, and they may develop diabetes in their 30s or 40s. Others are much slower, and they may not reach that finish line until their 60s or 70s. And some are running so slowly, they'll die of other causes before their glucose levels are ever officially diabetic. But make no mistake, whether you're running slow or fast, as long as you're eating the standard American diet or the standard British diet or the standard African diet or the standard Indian diet or the standard Saudi Arabian diet, you're in the race and you're headed for disaster. People like me and like Dr. Jason Fung and Dr. Richard Bernstein, Dr. Ken Berry, Dr. Sten Ekberg, and others are the ones on the sidelines shouting out to all the runners, "Stop! You're headed for disaster. This is a race you do not want to win." Some folks listen to us, and many do not. But we have to keep on shouting. The stakes are too high not to try. And every person who does stop running this terrible race is a victory. Years are added to people's lives, health improves, complications disappear, and people are able to age with dignity and enjoy the pleasure of their latter years lived out in health. So, yeah, there is definitely a genetic component to diabetes, but thank God there's also a lifestyle component. Again, there's nothing you can do to fix the genetic side of things. My mom had diabetes, and it absolutely spoiled the last 15 years of her life. And I inherited her body type with slim arms, slim legs, and a large belly. I inherited her tendency toward diabetes. But when diabetes tried to clamp its icy fingers around my neck, I got out of the race, changed my diet, and changed my future. That did not happen with my mom. Was it her fault that she had diabetes and suffered so much? Well, it was related to her diet, but in a way it was hardly her fault. When Mom became diabetic, she was told to cut the fat in her diet way down and, quote, watch your sugar. She did that, and it did not help. But she was doing what everybody was saying in those days, what almost every doctor, every nutritionist, and every dietitian was telling every American. She was doing what she knew to do. What she didn't know was that the advice they were giving her was dead wrong. She didn't need to watch her sugar, she needed to eliminate her sugar altogether. And she didn't need to cut the fat out of her diet, she needed to slash the carbohydrates down to around 30 to 40 grams per day. Today we're hearing a different message. Yes, there are many that still cling to that outdated advice to cut your fat, don't worry about eating too many carbs, but many others are rising up and saying this race you're running will have a bad end to it. Withdraw, resign, quit, turn back, don't even try to finish. Cut your carbs way down, create a diet based on meat and low-carb vegetables, do some light exercise, eat mostly whole foods, and watch those glucose levels drop, drop, drop. So the answer to the question, is diabetes genetically caused or is it your fault? The answer is yes, it is both. Now, you can't do anything to change your genes, but you can definitely change your lifestyle and your diet. And for most of us, that is all it will take.